Leroy, Sassicaia, Smitho Lafitte. Ever tasted these wines? Do you know where to find them?
Well, this episode of Wine Blast is brought to you in association with Ideal Wine, the Aladdin's Cave for wine lovers, delivering straight to your door. Visit idealwine.com for more. That's idealwine.com, or find the link in our show notes.
Hello and welcome to Wine Blast. On this show, we love to tell intriguing stories, and boy, do we have one for you in this episode, because we are talking Aoyun, a wine that's all about adventure, ambition, and changing the game.
But we're not talking Bordeaux or Australia here. We're talking China, and a very particular part of China at that, where tea, Tibetan culture, and towering mountains collide. Here's a taster of what's coming up.
It starts with a dream to create a world-class fine wine in China. We are in a very remote area, very far away from anything. We've got the longest ripening period of the world. So we are offering something different that is unique and that is new. We are sharing an adventure and we write chapter every day together.
Aoyun is basically a statement. We want to explore frontier winemaking in China, but it has such a evocative story. You know, people buy into stories. You know, it appeals to the poetic and the scientific and the adventurous side of all of us.
Aoyun winemaker Maxence Dulu and Chinese wine expert Janet Wang there. We'll be hearing more from them, as well as from Tom Baxter of Berry Brothers in Rudd in due course. We'll also be tasting this semi-mythical wine and giving our verdict on what it might mean for the future of Chinese wine in general.
Now, this episode follows on from the previous programme we did on Chinese wine, which was after your trip out there, I think, wasn't it? Early on in season 6. And I think it's a good place to start there because, you know, in that show, we did briefly touch on Aoyun and the wider Yunnan region as, and I quote, looking promising, with Chinese wine expert Natalie Wang describing Yunnan as being like the Burgundy of China versus Ningxia being its Bordeaux, sort of in terms of small-scale production, elegant wines. I think that's what we're getting at.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll put a link to that episode in our show notes, won't we? We also discussed Chinese wine in general and the Chinese wine market, which seems to be going through a fairly profound transition, with overall consumption falling, but a younger, more educated wine-consuming demographic coming onto the scene, who also seem more interested in drinking Chinese wine. So some interesting trends there, which all tie into what we're talking about here.
Yes, indeed. So let's start by setting the scene and perhaps explaining why we're choosing to focus on Aoyun. And just to be really clear, that is 2 words, A-O, second word, Y-U-N, Aoyun. Our pronunciation is not perfect. I apologise. We'll try. At its most basic, though, this is a wine that's just hard to ignore. It costs about 280 to 300 quid a bottle. So that's a statement in its own right. It's owned by multinational luxury group LVMH, you know, Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy, whose portfolio also includes things like Krug, Dom Perignon, Chateau d'Yquem, Cheval Blanc in Bordeaux. And then there's where it's from.
Not just China, but Yunnan, and more specifically, the Meili Mountain area of Shangri-La. Most ambitious wine projects in China to date have been in the big-ticket regions like Ningxia or Shandong. And when the Aoyun project was just a twinkle in LVMH's eye, Shangri-La, or the Meili Mountain region, was basically a remote backwater somewhere near Tibet, a land of family small holdings at high altitude, clinging to steep valley sides above the raging Mekong River, the last kind of place you might expect a global luxury corporation like LVMH to end up.
So that's where we start our story, with a dream. And a search. I sat down with Aoyun winemaker Maxence Dulu to get the inside steer on the story. By way of background, Maxence is originally from Bordeaux, but gamely joined the Aoyun project in 2012, shortly before the very first vintage in 2013. And this is how he described how it all started.
It starts with a dream to create a world-class fine wine in China. And this is the adventure of creating a Grand Cru in China. And this dream started in 2008. And, you know that to make a Grand Cru, you need to have a specific terroir. And so we searched during 4 years all around China from 2008 to 2012 to answer the question, are there some terroirs capable to make this type of wine? And if yes, where it would be?
So there we have the big question. Is China capable of producing great fine wine, something to challenge the Grand Cru of France and beyond? And if so, where?
And so the search began. Now, to get into the mindset of this search, I was thinking, and I thought my recommendation would be that we picture the Indiana Jones film, but the recent one, you know, with a kind of mature Harrison Ford, to put
Excellent.
it politely. Do you know what I mean?
I thought you were going to say The Simpsons, so I'm very happy that we're with Indiana Jones.
But
that
Indiana
sounds
Jones
fine.
With a slightly older Harrison Ford.
Yeah, the older
because this
version.
particular Indiana Jones adventurer and treasure hunter was Tony Jordan. Now, sadly, Tony died in 2019, but he was a very highly regarded Australian winemaker who worked with LVMH all around the world, establishing Domaine Chandon Australia, for example, consulting, mentoring and teaching as he went. So why was Tony chosen for this mission?
So Tony Jordan is a great winemaker, Australian winemaker, and he was a perfect person to find this place because, first of all, he was not afraid about moving mountain, Tony Jordan, as an Australian. And he's been all around China at 70 years old, which was very challenging. Then he was a no-compromise person, you know, and this is important because there's a lot of consultant, they can do a lot of compromise to get their cash at the end. And Tony would have said no if it was not possible. And the last point is, you know, there is two different style of wine, you know, that you can do with the same terroir, is all the power of the elegance. And the terroir have a big impact on this also. And Tony Jordan was a winemaker of elegance, fine wine, you know, and he was preaching fine wine in Australia in the 90s, far before everyone. And so this particular point helped us to find a terroir, to get a terroir capable to make fine, fresh wine with a long aging potential. So it starts with this long research by Tony Jordan in 2008.
And it was a long search. As Maxence says, for 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, Tony Jordan tirelessly scoured China, hunting for this needle in the haystack, the potential Grand Cru site. At times, it must have felt like he was searching for El Dorado.
Of course, he visited the likes of Ningxia and Xinjiang, where summers are very hot and dry and winters are so cold the vines need to be buried. He also looked at Shandong and coastal regions, but the seasonal rains and risks of dilution and rot were a risk that gave him pause for thought. Of course, every region was keen to court the LVMH investment, but Tony stubbornly resisted the siren calls and kept plugging away.
Until he found the mountain, and he didn't even need to move it. He heard about a warm, dry valley in the south of China, in the Yunnan Province, near the borders with Myanmar and Tibet. Now, Yunnan is more famous for its tea, like pu'er. It's incredibly naturally diverse, also known for growing tobacco and mushrooms, and apparently it's where cannabis originated. Either way, wine was far from being a headlining act in the area.
But Tony got wind of the fact that there were some vines growing in the Shangri-La region in northwest Yunnan. To put this in geological and topographical context, it's the far eastern edge of the Himalayan uplift, with steep river valleys running north-south, and the Mekong River Valley was the one he honed in on.
So this is low latitude. To give you an idea, it's similar latitude to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia or Luxor in Egypt. But what might otherwise be pretty warm conditions are tempered by the high altitude. So Tony's wine intuition kicked in and he went to visit.
And there were some vineyards. Okay, and there were, so not a lot, but there were 200 hectares of vineyard in the valley of the Mekong. at different altitude from 2000 to 2600 meter. And so he's been very surprised that nobody told him this. And he could also put some weather station to monitor the weather during a few years, and also come at different moments of the year to taste the grape, to see how the vines were growing. And he understood that it was possible to manage organically there because the climate was dry enough. And he tasted the grape just before the farmer were harvesting, and he saw the potential. So at the end, you never know when you look at the paper, when you look at the weather station. So it was fantastic to be able to have vineyard ready to make great wine if you change the way of managing them, but also to be able to taste the potential with your mouth.
So this was the light bulb moment. Well, sort of, because things were still conceptual at this stage, of course, but the potential was there. Tony was thinking, could this remote mountain area actually be transformed into a Chinese Grand Cru? There was a lot riding on this decision, not just money, but also reputation. So the pressure was on.
Yeah, I mean, having the precedent of vineyards in the area helped, of course. And while Yunnan wasn't really spoken about in terms of fine Chinese wine, this is actually an area with a fair bit of wine history in the Chinese context. French missionaries had brought grapes there in the late 19th century to make wine for the Eucharist. It wasn't great quality because it was made with hybrid grapes like rose honey, this being the time when phylloxera was busy wiping out vinifera vines in Europe. But it was proof of concept.
And this didn't go unnoticed. So when in the 2000s, the local government was looking to develop agriculture in the area to support local farmers, fight poverty and stem the rural exodus to big cities, wine was considered a valid option as a high-value crop. So the authorities helped some local farming families plant a few hectares of mainly Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc.
And this meant that when Tony Jordan arrived, he could see this pristine Cabernet vineyard giving healthy fruit in this amazing location. I mean, okay, it was being yielded very high and sold off to a big winery that blended it away. But this was the light bulb moment. He realised that if they could work to focus on quality with the farmers and local government, which is the ultimate landlord, they could make something special, a bit different.
But it rapidly became clear this was not going to be a walk in the park. This is mountain territory, steep gorges and river valleys, high altitude, remote, difficult terrain, a patchwork of small holdings. So one challenge was how to manage this. Currently, Ao Yun works across 32 hectares of vines. Now, 32 hectares of vines is pretty standard size for a sort of modest size wine
modest,
operation
yeah,
under one owner. But in Ao Yun's case, in Yunnan, those 32 hectares are managed by 120 different families. So how the hell does that work?
Alors, it's a lot you need to be good in logistics, but in China, Chinese are very good with logistics, but this is because, it is very small piece of land. You have to understand. So we've got the vineyard between 2,200 to 2,600 meters. Okay. Because it's at the latitude of middle of Morocco. So we compensate low latitude by altitude. And so it's very steep valley of the Mekong. Being at 2,600 meters, we still have mountain above us at 6,800. So there is 4,000 meters more above us. Very steep valley, very small terraces, and the villagers, they live in a virtuous circle, in autonomy because they are far away from everything. They are far away from civilization, and they cannot do intensive agriculture because it's too steep and too fragmented. Okay, so each family have 0.5, 1 hectare maximum, divide in 10, 20 different small blocks. Wow. And so this is why we've got so much family, because everything is done by hand, and so it's taking 2,400 hours per hectare per year of manual work in the vineyard. Okay, to give you an example, 2,400 for us, for the only vineyard managed 100% by hand in Europe, like in Switzerland, it's going to be 800. So it is more because it's more fragmented and it's more difficult, and the climate is cooler. So we need to work a lot. But this is why we have a lot of people working in this land, because very fragmented and everything is done by hand.
Does that not make it more expensive? And also, it must be a diplomatic challenge dealing with everyone's different interests.
Yeah. So for sure, it's more expensive. It's very expensive to produce wine there, and it is a challenge. We have the vineyard in 4 different villages. Each village has different altitude, different soil, different climate, different exposure. When you are on the flat surface, the exposure have a little impact. When you are on the steep slope, the exposure have a big impact. And then you've got the culture of the village, And so, for example, out of the 4 villages, we have 1 village named Senong at 2,300 meters. And we have to have a completely different way of managing the farmers than in Shuozhe at 2,500 meters compared to Adong and Shidang. So each village will have its own identity. You have to understand that 10 years ago it was like 2 or 3 hours to go from one village to another village. Now it's like 40 minutes. So there is, globally, we try to organize this way, we have a team of young Chinese winemaker, passionated, the more we go, the more they are local Chinese. So from Tibetan culture, from Tibetan minority, okay, because we are at the border, we are in the north of Yunnan, at the border of Tibetan province. So these are Chinese from different minority, and the local farmer, they are from Tibetan minority. So from one village to another village, they are Tibetan from Buddhism religion, but they have a different way of living. So we try to organize ourselves with this young Chinese winemaker managing the vineyard. Then we've got 1 viticulturist assistant per village. Then we've got 1 viticulturist managing 2 villages. Okay, and then we've got 1 vineyard coordinator managing the 4 villages. Working with the assistant viticulturist in the village, we've got a chief villager, which this one is local, helping the viticulturist assistant to manage the villager.
So this sounds complicated and expensive. 3 times the man hours per season of even the most hand-worked European vineyard.
Yeah,
I mean, Tony Jordan may have found it a great place for vines, but it's not the easiest for humans, especially those involved in a multinational wine operation.
Yeah, it does make you laugh. I mean, it comes across as a huge logistical and practical challenge. And maybe also here, we were sort of starting to get a feel for why this wine is so darn expensive to buy. But, we're going to come back to that. So, I wanted to probe a bit more on the subject of these challenges. And Maxence's first response was about personnel and personal issues.
After 12 years of experience, now I would say the most challenging is the human, like in every adventure. And so for us, it's difficult to find talent to come to live in our place, because we are in a very remote area, very far away from anything. And so you cannot breed a family. You cannot have kids, take them to school. So we depend on young people that have the capacity to live happy in this remote area with us, And so the challenge is to find them, and then to keep them motivated, to keep them growing, to limit the turnover.
And how have you found this adventure personally? Because as far as I understand, you've lived out there and you've immersed yourself. How's it been for you as a personal experience beyond all the winemaking?
Yeah, it was more a family experience than personal. So I've been very lucky to have Moët Hennessy offer me this opportunity, but then to have my wife accompany me with our 2 kids of 3 and 4 years old. And I always say this funny story that they employ me because of my wife. Because before, when I arrived, I was a technical director. There was 1 manager above me that told me at the end of the trip in November 2012, he told me, why we're going to take you? We're going to take you because of your wife. Because if your wife is not happy, you are not going to stay here. And this is the basic of expatriation. But in this place, in the middle of nowhere, at 3,300 meters, my family was living in Shangri-La, going to Chinese school for the kids. You need a supportive wife, very adventurous, more than me. So I've been very lucky to have my wife support me since the beginning, and she was happy to do this. So and I think this was a very good investment in life for us.
Now that's what I call dedication to the wine cause. Maxence and his family are back in France now, but he's in China 3 months a year, and as he said, they're trying to build up the local team as much as they can, which is surely wise, But this is a proper wine adventure.
Yeah. So we've got a remote high altitude location, challenging local politics, as we've heard, difficult for personnel and logistics. Maxence added that a related challenge is kind of to retain the vital knowledge they're gaining with every new vintage, if they do have an inevitable turnover of personnel. Because, while they can take advice from all over the world, ultimately it's only the reality of their immediate situation that can teach them what to do, and they can't afford to be making the same mistake repeatedly. No.
So we've mentioned the high altitude, and that is another challenge, isn't it? Apparently, for example, when it comes to making the blends for Ao Yun, a pretty standard procedure. Anywhere else, you get your team together and you work it out. Here, they have to bring all the wines down to sea level to taste before they can blend, because, as Maxence explains, the winery is at 2,600 meters altitude, so there's 25% less oxygen up there and very dry air. So your body and taste functions are impaired. So even the simple things are complex.
So many challenges. Makes for a great story, doesn't it? But I think overcoming those challenges, making it all worth it, that's the real story. And that's what we'll be coming on to next. Meantime, I did ask Maxence, who's a pretty laid-back, kind of relaxed character. I asked him what one thing he'd learned about life or wine from doing this project. And this is what he said.
Relax. Relax a little bit. The result will be better if you relax.
I actually love that as general advice for life.
Yeah.
So yes,
Agree.
We're now going to come on to the juicy bits. What's the wine actually like? How has it changed since the debut 2013 vintage? Does it justify its ambitious price tag? Who buys it? And what does all this mean for China? But first, a pause. By way of brief recap so far, it took an exhaustive search, ambitious vision, plus significant logistical and diplomatic skills to bring Ao Yun to life. But would this big bet on China's fine wine future pay off?
So I think it's time we honed in on the wine itself. Now, they do make more than one wine as part of this project. They make sort of small quantities of individual wines from each of the 4 villages, for example. But the main focus is on their top blend, Ao Yun. Their latest vintage, the 2021, is a blend of 57% Cabernet Sauvignon, 19% Cabernet Franc, 12% Merlot, 6% Syrah, and 6% Petit Verdot. I'm always slightly annoyed if those actually end up adding up to 100. I think that one probably does. It's 60% aged in stoneware jars and glass vats. It's 40% aged in barrels for 12 months. So I asked Maxence why that mix of grape varieties in this place.
Cabernet Sauvignon was planted before we arrived. But it was good for us because we don't do a cultivar wine, we do terroir wine. So the Cabernet Sauvignon is a translator. Okay, and we are happy with this translator because it's have the potential of elegance, finesse, aging potential, complexity. It's a translator that is used in Bordeaux also, but the terroir of Bordeaux is completely opposite as our terroir, and so the wine of Bordeaux are opposite as our wine. The Cabernet in our place is doing wine very different.
But you've also got some other varieties now, haven't you? You've got Syrah, Petit Verdot, Merlot. Anything else at the moment that you have?
The main translator is Cabernet. Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc is always more than 80% usually of the blend. And then in 2013, we planted a little bit more Cabernet, but we added indeed Petit Verdot, Syrah, Merlot, and even a little bit of Sangiovese that is not in production yet, because this one we added later, and a little bit of Malbec that we added a few years ago also that is not yet vinified. We mainly do one wine that we name Aoyun, that is a blend of the best grape of the 4 villages, from 2,100 to 2,600 meters. What is best for us, and under this climate, best for us is not the most powerful. Best for us is the most elegant, the most complex, with the right level of freshness. Too much fresh going on the greenness, we don't put. Too varietal, if it's tasting like Cabernet, we don't put. This is the best for us. The best is expressing the place, expressing the vintage through finesse and elegance. So this is this lot that we blend together to do our Yun every year. Translating the terroir and the vintage the best we can.
How would you sum up the essence of this place as expressed in the wine in just a few words?
So I think if we go, we have a cool climate globally, and this is expressed in the wine. If we want to synthesize, the climate is globally cool, with the end of season that is ripening the grape very slowly. So very interesting parameter is we've got the longest growing period, ripening period of the world. We harvest sometimes Cabernet Sauvignon until end of November because of specificity of the climate, the shade of the mountain, the coolness of the night, the altitude. So globally, we've got the climate that is cool, and this is translating into the wine into a paradox between freshness and ripeness in terms of aroma, I would say. Then in terms of balance, you've got a paradox and a uniqueness, again, unique paradox that you don't find in other wine between tension and density. You've got this acidity. We've got acidity of white wine. When you do the analyze in the laboratory, you measure the total acidity, the pH, we call it. And the pH that we have, for example, in the vintage 2020, it's 3.35. So it's a pH of white wine. Okay, this is unique in the world of fine Cabernet to have this freshness in the balance, and it's balanced with other components that make it very well balanced. And finally, you've got very soft tannin coming from the strong UV light. So at this altitude, you've got stronger UV light. The sun is stronger. This is why the Tibetan people, they have a brown skin, because it's sunny, but also the sun is strong. And this is going to create a thicker skin. So the skin is going to protect from the sun with being thicker. So we will have more component into the skin, more tannin, and more color. Okay. So we've got a lot of color in our wine. You have to understand that color is proportional to softness in the wine. The more you have color at the same quantity and quality of tannin, the more you will have a soft texture. And then also these UV light are very strong, so they manage to ripe better the tannin of the skin and the tannin of the seeds also. It's going through the skin even if it's thick, and it's permitted to have a riper seeds tannin. Voilà. So this is a specificity also of our wine. There is a velvety texture. And finally, there is a kind of salinity, minerality that you can find also from this terroir.
Really interesting that he's looking more than anything for elegance and freshness, complexity from the long season, and soft tannin, not too fresh or too varietal, but balanced.
Yeah. And we'll come on to how that may have evolved over time, and also what we make of the wine too. But in the meantime, I think we should bring in Janet Wang. And Janet is an award-winning wine writer, author of The Chinese Wine Renaissance, which we referenced in our last episode too. She's followed Aoyun closely over the years, so we wanted to get her take on the project and the wine.
I am a huge fan of what Aoyun has achieved in China. First of all, just by putting Yunnan on the map, And not just for the world, but also for Chinese people themselves. For generations, we've been told luxury goods come from the Western world, and Aoyun is basically a statement to say, China offers such a vast terrain, interesting terroir. We want to explore frontier winemaking in China. And it's a statement of intent from the beginning. And also when the wine has come out, it's a luxury good, but it has such a evocative story. People buy into stories. It appeals to the poetic and the scientific and the adventurous side of all of us. So I think it's a fabulous success story. It's really elevated the whole Shangri-La Yunnan area as a production, wine producing region, attracted a lot of smaller wineries, boutique wineries to set up in Yunnan now as well. And also tourism, it's brought on a lot of positive impact to the region. As a wine itself, I personally think it's a fabulous wine. It has this really, you do taste the high altitude, the ethereal quality. Yes, it's a Bordeaux blend, so you can draw a comparison to, like Lafite, Pauillac. But it also has this very specific terroir feature of Shangri-La, of the high altitude, of these clouds and shades. For me, it has a lovely sort of temple incense, which is very Asia to me on the finish. And so I think it's a fantastic wine to showcase a top quality China terroir. Yeah.
And you talk about it so beautifully and evocatively. Has that changed over the years? I mean, presumably you're talking about Aoyun today. The first vintage was 2013. Have you seen it evolve?
Yes. In fact, the incense I'm talking about is probably the earlier vintages rather than the late. I think over time, they have worked out more precisely which plot does best with what grapes, and also how much oak, how much terracotta pot, the jars they use to age the wine. So over time, there's you can feel the wines is getting more precise. In fact, the later vintages I've tasted are actually more structural, leaner in style than the earlier ones, which is perhaps a bit more floral forward. But all through all the vintages, I think you can say the balance is fantastic. And there's always this elegance, because it's high altitude, it does have generous fruit, but also this lovely acidity, freshness to balance it. And it's a very elegant wine throughout the vintages.
Very interesting. And just to add a minor tangential point, Aoyun translates as soaring above the clouds, which of course points to the altitude, but also a bit what Janet is getting at, that sort of freshness and ethereal quality she describes in the wine.
Janet also said other wineries have now set up in Yunnan. She mentioned the likes of Célèbre, Shaoling, Sacred Land as smaller premium wineries. Also on the larger scale side, Yunnan Winery, which has apparently improved since Aoyun was established. And beyond the Bordeaux varieties, she also tipped Marcelin and Chardonnay as grapes that perform well here. Also ice wine as a sweet option for something a bit different.
And of course, Penfolds, I saw, the Australian producer that sells so well in China. Penfolds are also now making wine from Yunnan, albeit as part of a cross-regional blend, as far as I can make out. But, I was interested in Janet's point about Aoyun being a statement of intent about a premium luxury product that's not Western in origin, but Chinese. She said a bit more about this.
I think actually it's a very smart business move from LVMH's perspective, because there are a lot of luxury goods purchases in China. People love buying luxury goods, but for several generations we've been told luxury goods come from the West. But it's almost unfortunate that China is associated in recent decades with low-cost manufacturing. But if you go to a museum and look at things that the Chinese used to make, you know it's a country, that is very into sort of good taste and can innovate and be very creative. So what Aoyun has said is basically we can make a luxury product in China, which is offering very unique terroir features. And in recent years, Chinese people, as China has become richer. We talk a lot about cultural confidence, which is to say, why do we always look to the West for luxury? For some sort of definition of high quality. Actually, what we could show the world is actually we have something to say as well, and we have something to offer too. And Aoyun is one of the best examples of showcasing, a luxury brand making a really high quality and unique product out of China. So Chinese consumers, I think, are beginning to embrace this concept as well.
Do you think the fact it is LVMH, does that help in this transition to understanding that China can make its own luxury goods?
Oh, it does. I think undoubtedly the fact that the LVMH is doing Aoyun is a great confidence boost to the whole Chinese wine industry.
I also asked Maxence about this same point, whether Aoyun was changing perceptions of China and what Chinese wine is capable of.
I think we are part of this team, proving to the world that China can make excellence, so changing the mentality toward China, Chinese, and made in China. Very small scale, but this is what we are doing. We are doing excellence in China, and a lot of people have a preconceived idea that is not possible. And we are doing it every day, thanks to a lot of work, attention to detail, and commitment and passion from our fantastic team. And it's made by Chinese. I'm the only foreigner, it's made 100% by Chinese.
Now, we are talking luxury products here, so we have to come on to price and commercial reality. And to do that, we talked with Berry Brothers and Rudd Asia buyer Tom Baxter, who's based in Hong Kong. First up, though, we wanted to get his take on Aoyun as a wine.
It's a very interesting label to discuss because I think it very neatly sums up some of the ambition that is alive in the wine production of China. It is one which I think has also climbed in quality very, very quickly. We're talking about a wine which had its, the first vintage in 2013. It is one that I've had the chance to taste a number of times back in that time when it was first coming onto the market, the first vintage in 2013. But what I've seen happen is that in the style of the wine, I remember it being, very concentrated, quite sort of pointed in acidity, as you might expect, that elevation. It's the tannin profile, I think, and the balance of the tannin profile versus the generosity of the mid palate of the wine, which I think has changed the most and very quickly. I remember it being impressive. I remember it having quite a marked oak component to the profile back then. But most recently, tasting the 2021, which was released quite recently, it is much more polished. There's much more harmony, really, at this early age between the oak, the quite compact tannins, because there's quite a lot of UV radiation at that elevation, of course. And clearly it manages to be a wine which has got a lot of aging potential with the concentration, but it's still approachable. And they've managed to make the core of the fruit sort of come to the fore quite a bit more, which is quite impressive. So I really saw quite a difference there.
Interesting how he's seen the evolution of the wine. Janet said something similar, didn't she, about it becoming more refined, the result of sort of refining the blend and winemaking. And actually, I did quiz Maxence about this, and he confirmed that after the first few vintages, they did start very consciously working to tame, or, to manage the concentration and power of the fruit and the tannin in the wine to sort of promote delicacy and improve aging potential. That's what he said.
Yeah, but to come back to commercial matters, we wanted Tom to talk about where the wine sells and how it goes down commercially. He said he'd seen it in North America, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the UK. And Maxence confirmed that sales were roughly a third each in North America, Asia, and Europe, with a significant chunk sold in China itself. I asked Tom who was buying Aoyun?
I think it might still be a little early to say. Generally speaking, even very open-minded and informed consumers are still really dipping a toe, as it were, into Chinese wine, particularly very premium Chinese wine. It's something as a category that's been around in even in mass market retail in the UK since the late 2000s, around 08, 09 or so, I remember. So it's been around in even mature markets, but the fact that they're still, I think, trying to lock in their customer base, their collector base for the future as well, I think shows that the progress is still relatively slow. But it doesn't mean it's any less exciting. I feel as though identifying the target market for the future is one of the big challenges that Aoyun faces, but Chinese wine as a whole faces. It's a question that I feel is still being answered at the moment.
So not a very clear picture and a tough sell, but not without potential. He did also say that Chinese wine needed a narrative, point of difference or specialization that people could hang their hats on, as it were. We might just come back to that briefly.
Yeah, I also asked Tom about price, because at nearly £300 a bottle, that's going to have a commercial impact. He said the price signalled the ambition of the project, and now that critically acclaimed vintages like 2020 and 2021 are coming on stream, the maths was starting to add up. That said,
the challenge it poses to people who are already seasoned wine collectors is that they are going to be a bit more market savvy than your average wine consumer. And so they're immediately going to think, well, for a more known entity to me, I can pay the same amount and get X, Y, and Z Chateau in Bordeaux that I've been buying for 10, 15 years, possibly. Therein lies the challenge to succinctly communicate the excitement around the project, the ambitions for the future, and most importantly, I think the style of the wine and why it's different. Because if you drink it alongside a bottle of Bordeaux, it is markedly different. There is a more insistent feel to the tannins. The acidity is really energizing. There's a real tension to it. So I think when it comes to merchants such as us selling it, or anyone else who wants to sell it, it's all the more incumbent, I think, on us to get that message across. When it comes to something like Brunello or Bordeaux or Napa Cabernet, there's kind of so much of that work has been done in the background because its target market is established. People know what the style is, and a lot of the time there's commercial awareness of different brands. All of those things that I've just listed don't really apply for Aoyun. So I think those are the challenges that lie ahead.
We also asked Janet about Aoyun's pricing, and this is what she said.
To be fair, I think there is appeal and demand for wines at every price. Aoyun is not trying to pretend that it's every person's wine. It is trying to tell a story about frontier winemaking. And it is to say, how much can we push to discover new regions, new ways of making wine? And I think probably above £20, we're all buying into some sort of brand and story, right? But Aoyun has the strongest story, one of the strongest story you'll find, I think. And therefore, I think pricing is fine, because if you look at their portfolio, right, you're talking about Yunnan Cru, all that stuff. And Aoyun is one of the most expensive wines they produce. The cost for them is very high.
Which is a fair point, one we touched on earlier. Finally, here's what Maxence had to say about Aoyun's price.
First of all, we are not sharing another version of Margaux terroir or Napa Valley terroir. We are offering a new terroir expression. So we are offering something different that is unique and that is new. Then we've got this fantastic, this unique way of working. We do everything by hand. Everything is very sustainable. So we are working with villager, and we are organic since the first vintage, but we are much more than organic. We live in this virtuous circle. The villager live in the virtuous circle with the nature. So they have some plant, the vineyard, feeding the animal. So they feed the animal with a cane. In winter, they give the cane to the yak. During the season, they give the leaf to the pig. remove the grass, the weed, and so there is this virtuous circle that is really unique, and that we cultivate. Well, and finally, we have this fantastic adventure to share, and we are not sharing 200 years of history. We are sharing an adventure, and we write chapter every day together.
What price to put on adventures, on a great story, selling the dream. Okay, so on this somewhat esoteric note, I think we should bring things back down to earth and taste this wine we've been jabbering about so much, and say what we think. Here we go.
Good call. I'm in there already. Okay, so I tasted the 2015 and the 2020 vintages in fairly quick succession. I wasn't so impressed with the 2015. I found it a bit chunky and big and slightly hollow, maybe sort of tying in with what Tom and Janet were alluding to. Certainly, I didn't really think it justified its price tag.
Yeah, and then the 2020?
Totally different story. This is the one that we have got here, and it's an absolutely terrific wine. Really, in intense nose of bell pepper, tobacco leaf, and cedar wood, and also rich, dark blackberry fruit. And what you notice immediately on the palate is the texture. The tannins are so fine; they're almost fragrant. There's an ethereal and exotic quality to the wine. I would say there is some warming alcohol, but it's just so incredibly accomplished and refined. There's definitely a Cabernet character, but it also has its own identity. It's really hard not to be impressed by this wine, even taking the price into account.
I agree. It's a very impressive wine, isn't it? It's so kind of, there's a sort of pristine quality to it. Very fragrant and as you said, fine texture. I think lots of people will love this wine, and I mean love this wine. It's a kind of beautiful blend of intensity and elegance.
Yeah, I mean, but what did you make though of the 2021, which is the current release as we're recording?
Yeah. I mean, similarly impressive in a different style. It's got the same sort of dark colour and tons of a rich, ripe, dark fruit initially on the nose, but then also roasted pepper and leafy tones emerge, and over time a kind of sweet spice comes out in the glass, almost sort of incense, with hints of dried flowers and molasses and blood orange peel. But do you know what? It was the palate that impressed me most. It has a real freshness and finesse that just lifts all that complexity with a kind of weightless quality. It's almost balletic across the palate. The tannins are so fine and precise. It has none of the thickness and heft you might expect, partly from the nose as well. It's all about poise and grace. I'd say slightly leaner and tauter than this 2020 in style, but in a good way. It's very stylish and balanced. Really impressive. Easily the best Chinese red I've tasted.
Bold words, and a lot of them.
Sorry, I was on a roll. I couldn't
Normally
stop
I'd have
myself.
stopped you, but I was just enjoying my 2020.
Oh, good. Well, that's nice. Works for
but I think if you sum it all up, what we essentially like is the fact these wines are not overdone, which is what you always fear from an ambitious, newish, lavishly funded wine project. That may have been the case with the early vintages, if my 2015 verdict is anything to go by. But now they're clearly working on creating elegance and refinement in the wine. And that's absolutely the right way to go, in my view.
Yeah, this is an important point. I completely agree. There's always a temptation to pander to the market, to fear the market almost, isn't there? Especially from what I understand in the Chinese market, where they do tend to like sweeter, rounder, easier going styles of reds. But, I totally agree. I think if Ao Yun wants to build a global reputation for being a Grand Cru wine, it needs to be refined and serious and age-worthy, not just big and oaky and hefty, because that style of wine rarely stands the test of time.
No, you're right. As well as being elegant, it also needs to be distinctive. It needs to have something unique to say. And I think you do get a sense of that in those sweet spices, that ethereal and exotic and lifted quality that's definitely there. It would be great to see that distinctiveness of the wine developing over time too. And a slightly lighter bottle, I'd say.
That would be nice too.
It would. Either way, you do feel this wine does have the potential to be a game changer for China.
Oh, well, but those are big words too. You're coming back at my big words with even bigger words. Okay, that's here. You heard it here first, folks. And yeah, I suppose you could ask, as we did in our last episode on China, whether Cabernet Sauvignon is or should be the grape of the future for China. You know, the grape this wine's based around. But I guess, you know, if it works, as it clearly does here for Aoyong, there's no reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It just works. It's good wine. You know, why change it? But, you know, I also agree it's a good idea to try other things, as they clearly are with Syrah, Sangiovese.
I think they've got Sangiovese, haven't they? Yeah.
I mean, you know, why not? And hopefully, you know, other producers will experiment in Yunnan too, as Janet said, to see what else works there.
And on that note, this is how Janet said she sees the future for Aoyong and Yunnan.
Aoyong and Yunnan in general is one of the most exciting wine regions coming from out of China. So for me personally, I'm seeing a lot of free thinking, a lot of freedom to experiment, because they are small production. They don't have the huge pressure of having to shift volumes. So they can really try new things in Yunnan. And also because they are slightly latecomer, they have learned a few lessons. So they don't have to go through exactly the same path and make the same mistakes as some of the other regions, you know, in terms of trying out varieties and styles. So there's a lot of freedom, potential, and creativity in the winemaking, which you can feel. Drinking Yunnan wine, it feels like a very poetic, artistic hand that's been involved in the winemaking process. So yeah, so I think it's a very, very exciting region.
Tom Baxter also described Aoyong's future as bright. So as we look to the future, time to wrap things up. By way of closing summary, Aoyong is not only an impressive, distinctive wine with an intriguing story to tell, it also has the potential to be a game changer, not just for the Yunnan province, but also Chinese wine as a whole. Is it a defining Chinese Grand Cru? Time will tell. Either way, this is a story well worth following. And if you can, tasting.
Now, we'll put wine details, photos and maps on our website show notes. Thanks to our interviewees, Maxence Dulu, Janet Wang and Tom Baxter. And thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.
Thank you for listening right to the end of the programme. You deserve some sort of medal or maybe a glass of fine wine, whatever. Either way, if you're a regular Wine Blast listener, you'll know we do occasional sponsorships, both episodic and headline. You might not have thought of this, but if you're involved with a company, brand or region who could benefit from exposure to a top-notch global community of wine lovers, get in touch.
Wine Blast goes out to 200 countries and thousands of listeners. It's won multiple awards and is regularly one of the highest ranking drinks shows in global charts, with a knack of making national and international headlines, despite being a totally independent production made with a lot of passion and hard graft. If you'd like to support the show and take your message to an ever-growing global audience, get in touch by emailing contact@susieandpeter.com. That address is also on our website show notes, or you can find us on social media.